Welcome to Nazir Fears, where fear finds you. Do you dare to enter a world of unspeakable horror and chilling mysteries?
Like, subscribe, share, and click that bell icon.
The Vanishing Light of Point Wilson, Lighthouse Point. Wilson Lighthouse, situated on the edge of the Puget Sound in Washington state, has long been a symbol of safety for sailors navigating the treacherous waters. Built in 1881, this lighthouse has stood the test of time, guiding countless ships away from the rocky shores and towards safe harbor. However, despite its role as a beacon of hope, there are whispers of a much darker history that has followed the lighthouse for generations. The story I'm about to share begins in 1927, a year that forever changed the course of the lighthouse's existence. This tale, passed down through generations of lighthouse keepers and locals, involves a strange series of events that left the once reliable beacon of light flickering out, never to shine again. It's a tale that involves eerie disappearances, strange visions, and a mysterious force that seemed to possess the lighthouse, one that was never fully understood. The keeper at Point Wilson Lighthouse in 1927 was a man named Harold Granger. He had been serving at the lighthouse for nearly a decade and was known for his dedication to his work. Granger was a man who respected the solitude the job provided. The lighthouse, situated in a remote part of the coastline, was not an ideal place for anyone seeking social interaction. However, it had been perfect for Granger, who had no family and preferred the company of his thoughts and the sound of the ocean crashing against the rocks. In the fall of that year, Harold had been experiencing something unsettling. Over the course of several nights, he had noticed that the light from the beacon seemed to behave unusually. It would flicker sporadically, not like the usual power failures he was accustomed to, but as though something was interfering with its function. Sometimes the light would go out completely, and he would find himself stumbling in the dark, trying to restart the lanterns, only to have them flicker back on after a few minutes. At first, Harold thought it was just wear and tear on the equipment, but as the days passed, things started to feel off. It began on a stormy night when Harold noticed the lighthouse light had not gone out, but rather it was being blocked by something. He had been inside the station, making his rounds, when he noticed something strange on the horizon. Through the rain-splattered windows, he thought he saw a figure standing in the distance, its shadow casting across the rocks near the base of the lighthouse. Thinking it was just a trick of the storm, Harold grabbed his oil lamp and went to investigate. However, when he reached the base, there was nothing. No figure, no footprints, just the relentless crashing of waves against the jagged rocks. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences intensified. Harold could hear whispers in the wind as he climbed the narrow staircase to the top of the lighthouse. But when he reached the lantern room, no one was there. The sound would stop as soon as he reached the top, and yet every time he left the room, the whispers would start again. He attributed the whispers to the wind and the way the stormy weather carried sounds across the sound. But what really unsettled him was the consistent failure of the light. One evening, just after sunset, the light in the lantern room flickered and then went completely dark. Harold, now thoroughly spooked, climbed the stairs to find the source of the problem. He knew the equipment was old, but never had he seen it fail like this. Upon entering the Phantom Keeper of Cape Hatteras. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, located on the Outer Banks of North Carolina, is one of the tallest brick lighthouses in the United States. It has guided countless ships safely through the dangerous waters of the Atlantic Ocean for over 150 years. But for all its beauty and importance, The lighthouse has long been shrouded in mystery, particularly the story of the lighthouse keeper, Thomas McClellan, and the haunting that still plagues the station to this very day. Thomas McClellan was hired as the head keeper of Cape Hatteras Lighthouse in 1897, a year after the lighthouse had been fully automated. Before then, it had been manned by a team of keepers, each working in shifts to maintain the powerful light that guided vessels away from the treacherous sandbars and deadly shoals of the Outer Banks. McClellan had a reputation for being a dedicated worker, but even before his arrival at Cape Hatteras, whispers about his troubled past had started to follow him. His previous postings had been marked by mysterious disappearances and strange accidents that seemed to plague the men who worked alongside him. But the authorities overlooked these rumors, and McClellan was entrusted with the Cape Hatteras station. On his first night alone in the lighthouse, Thomas McClellan reported an unsettling feeling of unease. His quarters, which were attached to the lighthouse structure, were simple but cozy. The sounds of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below were comforting at first, but soon McClellan began to hear strange noises, low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves. His initial thoughts were that it was just the wind, but the noises persisted every night, growing louder and more insistent, as though something, or someone, was trying to communicate with him. Despite these disturbances, McClellan carried on with his duties. He climbed the spiral staircase to the top of the lighthouse each night to ensure the beacon was operating properly. But during these late-night rounds, he began to notice something unsettling. As he reached the top of the lighthouse tower, he swore that he could see figures in the distance, standing just outside the circle of light cast by the beacon. They were vague at first, just fleeting shadows, but each night they grew more distinct. McClellan's heartbeat would quicken, his breath shallow as he struggled to focus on the figures, only for them to vanish into the darkness as soon as the light passed over them. It wasn't long before McClellan began to question his own sanity. Had he truly seen something, or was the isolation of the lighthouse playing tricks on his mind? But things took a darker turn when he started seeing figures in the lighthouse itself. One night, while he was adjusting the light mechanism at the top of the tower, he heard footsteps behind him. He spun around, expecting to see one of the assistant keepers, but there was no one there. The room was empty. The eerie sensation that he wasn't alone became so overwhelming that he began to lock himself in the tower at night, unwilling to venture down to the station below. As the weeks passed, the disturbances escalated. McClellan began to experience vivid nightmares, waking in a cold sweat to the sound of the same heavy footsteps following him around the lighthouse. In these dreams, he would see a tall figure, dressed in the old-fashioned clothing of a former lighthouse keeper, standing at the base of the lighthouse, staring up at him. The figure's face was always obscured, but McClellan could feel its eyes burning into him. The final straw came on a stormy night in late October. A powerful nor'easter had swept in off the coast, its winds howling and waves crashing violently against the rocky shores. McClellan had been battling the storm all night, keeping the light shining against the ever-encroaching darkness. But as he climbed the stairs that night, he saw something he couldn't explain. At the top of the lighthouse, where the light should have been casting its usual beam across the sea, McClellan found the lens flickering. It was as though something was blocking the light, but there was no visible obstruction. The air grew frigid, and for the first time in weeks, McClellan heard the footsteps again, this time louder and faster, as if someone was running up the tower toward him. He turned to see a shadowy figure standing at the top of the stairs, its face still hidden. The figure was tall and seemed to be glowing faintly, as if illuminated by some unseen light. McClellan froze, his heart racing in his chest. The figure took a step forward and then, just as quickly, vanished into the wall. The lantern flared up again, its light piercing through the stormy night sky. But McClellan didn't stay to investigate further. He fled the tower and ran down the stairs, his feet slipping on the damp steps as he desperately tried to escape the presence that seemed to have taken over the lighthouse. By the time McClellan reached the base of the lighthouse, he was breathless and terrified. He bolted the door to his quarters and huddled in his bed, shaking uncontrollably. But the footsteps didn't stop. They seemed to echo through the entire lighthouse, moving from room to room. McClellan clutched his pillow tightly, trying to block out the sound. But it was no use. The footsteps grew louder, until finally there was a knock at his door. He opened the door to find nothing but a gust of cold wind. The storm had died down, but the eerie presence of the lighthouse seemed to linger in the air. McClellan, who had never been one to entertain superstition, could no longer deny that something was terribly wrong with the lighthouse. The next day, McClellan vanished without a trace. His colleagues and the local authorities launched a search, but there was no sign of him. His belongings were found in his quarters, and the light continued to shine without interruption, but McClellan was never seen again. There was no indication of foul play, and the storm that night had left no evidence of his disappearance. The lighthouse was fully operational when the next keeper arrived, and it was as if McClellan had never existed. Since then, there have been countless reports of strange phenomena at Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. Visitors often report hearing footsteps echoing in the tower, and some claim to have seen a shadowy figure standing at the top of the lighthouse, staring out at the sea. Locals tell of hearing the sound of a voice calling out in the night, but when they investigate, no one is there. Some say the lighthouse keeper, Thomas McClellan, is still there, haunting the tower he once tended to, lost in time and trapped between the world of the living and the dead. The Cape Hatteras Lighthouse continues to operate, its beam slicing through the dark waters of the Atlantic. But for those who know its history, the lighthouse is more than just a beacon for ships. It is a reminder that some places carry with them the weight of the past, haunted by the restless spirits of those who never truly left. The Curse of St. Augustine Lighthouse. The St. Augustine Lighthouse, located in Florida, is one of the oldest and most iconic lighthouses in the United States. It has guided countless ships along the treacherous coastlines of the Atlantic Ocean for over 150 years. While the lighthouse itself is a stunning piece of history, it is also the focal point of one of the most disturbing and tragic stories ever associated with a lighthouse. The tale of the St. Augustine Lighthouse and its curse begins with the story of Joseph Andrew, a young keeper who, in the early 1800s, was assigned to watch over the lighthouse. Joseph was just a boy when he was chosen to assist his father at the lighthouse. His father, William Andrew, had been a dedicated lighthouse keeper for years, and Joseph was eager to learn the ropes. The two of them lived in the small lighthouse keeper's quarters, isolated from the nearby town of St. Augustine. The only company they had were the occasional sailors who passed through and the ever-present sound of the crashing waves against the rocks below. Life was quiet, but never dull, for a lighthouse keeper's job was one that required constant attention and vigilance. On a particularly stormy night, a terrible accident would forever alter the course of Joseph's life. The storm that night was unlike any the lighthouse had ever seen. The winds howled ferociously, and the waves pounded against the cliffs with such force that the lighthouse's foundation shook. As the storm raged on, William Andrew sent Joseph to the lighthouse tower to check the light, which had begun to flicker. It was crucial that the light stayed on during the storm to guide ships safely away from the dangerous coastline. Joseph ascended the narrow stairs to the top of the lighthouse, feeling the weight of the storm pressing down on him. The winds outside seemed to scream in fury, and the lightning illuminated the sky, casting strange shadows on the walls of the tower. As he reached the top, he found the light dimming, its usual bright beacon barely visible. The storm had weakened the mechanical system that powered the lanterns, and Joseph struggled to get the light working again. Just as he adjusted the controls, a violent gust of wind burst through the tower window, shattering the glass and forcing him off balance. The storm seemed to come alive, its power overwhelming. As Joseph regained his footing, he reached for the lantern, only to have the light extinguish completely. Desperate to keep the flame going, Joseph attempted to relight it. However, just as he was about to strike the match, the tower was struck by a bolt of lightning, sending a surge of energy through the metal structure. In that instant, Joseph's life was changed forever. The blast from the lightning knocked him off his feet, sending him tumbling down the narrow stairs of the lighthouse. He landed hard on the floor, unconscious. When he awoke, he was alone in the tower. His father, William, had disappeared, and the lighthouse was eerily silent. Joseph searched the lighthouse for his father, but there was no sign of him. He rushed outside into the storm, calling out for his father. The wind drowned out his cries, and the torrential rain made it impossible to see. As he searched along the rocky coastline, Joseph stumbled upon something horrifying: the lifeless body of his father, washed up on the shore. He had been struck by the same lightning bolt that had knocked Joseph unconscious. The storm had claimed his life. Grief-stricken and alone, Joseph was forced to take over his father's duties as the lighthouse keeper. The tragedy, however, seemed to have marked the lighthouse with a strange and unsettling presence. As Joseph carried out his work, he began to hear strange sounds at night, whispers that echoed through the tower, the sounds of footsteps climbing the stairs when no one was there. Some nights, the lighthouse light would flicker, just as it had the night of his father's death, as if the tower itself was alive, remembering the horrible events. The curse of the St. Augustine Lighthouse did not end with Joseph's father. After his tragic death, a new keeper arrived, Thomas Hargrove, who would later be tasked with maintaining the lighthouse. But as Thomas began his tenure, he too began to experience strange and unexplained phenomena. Thomas reported hearing loud banging noises in the middle of the night, and sometimes the lighthouse would shake violently, as though something, or someone, was trying to break in. It wasn't long before locals began to notice something unsettling about the lighthouse. They said they could see strange lights flickering in the tower on stormy nights, even though the light was supposed to be automated. Sailors passing by would sometimes report seeing figures in the windows of the lighthouse at odd hours, figures that appeared to be watching the horizon. But when the ships drew closer, the lighthouse appeared empty. Those who worked at the nearby docks claimed they heard strange sounds coming from the tower at night, like the echo of a man's voice or the ringing of a bell. But when they investigated, the lighthouse was always locked and deserted. Over the years, stories spread of a ghostly figure in the tower, a figure that appeared to be the spirit of a lighthouse keeper trapped in the tower for eternity. Some said it was Joseph Andrew, still mourning his father's death and unable to escape the curse that had befallen the lighthouse. Others believed it was William Andrew's restless spirit, forever wandering the tower looking for his son. Still, others said the spirit was a mix of both men, forever bound to the lighthouse and cursed to continue their work in death as they had in life. Locals who lived near the lighthouse would often report hearing the faint sound of a bell tolling from the top of the tower, even though no bell had ever been installed. They also spoke of seeing strange lights and shadows moving behind the windows at night, despite the fact that the lighthouse was officially closed to the public after dark. The rumors of the haunting reached a peak when a group of paranormal investigators visited the St. Augustine Lighthouse in the early 2000s. Equipped with infrared cameras, EVP, electronic voice phenomenon recorders, and motion detectors, the team spent an entire night inside at the lighthouse, hoping to capture evidence of the spirits that haunted it. What they found was chilling. Throughout the night, their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, and several members of the team reported hearing whispers and footsteps behind them, even though the space was empty. One investigator swore that they saw a shadowy figure standing at the top of the staircase, watching them, before it disappeared into the darkness. Perhaps the most unnerving discovery was the recording of a voice on their EVP recorder. The voice, a low and mournful whisper, could clearly be heard saying, "Help me, I'm still here." The investigators were certain they had captured the voice of a ghost, most likely the spirit of one of the lighthouse keepers who had tragically perished. Despite these findings, the lighthouse remains an active site for paranormal activity, with many visitors and workers alike claiming to feel an eerie presence as they walk through its corridors. The St. Augustine Lighthouse, still standing tall on the Florida coastline, is now a historic site and popular tourist destination. But for those who know its history, it's also a reminder of the terrible events that have left a curse on the place, a curse that continues to haunt the lighthouse to this very day. To this day, the lighthouse still stands, its beam shining over the Atlantic Ocean, but locals still talk about the mysterious voices and lights, and the ghostly figures that appear in the tower. Some believe the spirits of Joseph and William Andrew have never left, still keeping watch over the lighthouse as they did in life, trapped in a never-ending cycle of duty and death. The haunted light of the ghost ship, the eerie and isolated coastline of Nova Scotia, Canada, is home to some of the most famous lighthouses in the world. But among them, the Peggy's Cove Lighthouse, perched high on a granite cliff overlooking the wild Atlantic Ocean, is shrouded in one of the most chilling tales of ghostly apparitions, lost ships, and a sinister curse. It is a place steeped in history, yet often whispered about for the events that still haunt its grounds, especially the story of the mysterious ghost ship that haunts the lighthouse. The Peggy's Cove Lighthouse has stood as a beacon of hope for sailors for more than a century, guiding ships safely through the deadly waters of St. Margaret's Bay. But unlike most lighthouses, Peggy's Cove is not just a symbol of safety. It is a gateway to a curse that has plagued this area for generations. The legend of the ghost ship begins in the early 1900s. With the mysterious disappearance of the Mermaid, a merchant ship that vanished without a trace, one stormy night. The Mermaid was a well-known cargo ship that plied the waters of the North Atlantic. One winter's evening in 1911, the ship was en route from Halifax to New York when it encountered a violent storm just off the coast of Peggy's Cove. The ship's captain, Captain Jonathan Fay, had been a seasoned seaman with years of experience, and he was confident in his ability to navigate the storm. However, that night, something went terribly wrong. The winds howled, the waves grew monstrous, and the Mermaid was soon in danger of capsizing. Despite the desperate attempts of the crew, the ship disappeared into the storm. No distress signal was ever sent, no wreckage was ever found. In the days following the storm, rumors began to spread around the village of Peggy's Cove. Fishermen who were accustomed to the violent nature of the ocean spoke of strange lights seen on the water that night. They described glowing orbs hovering just above the waves and a shadowy figure at the helm of the Mermaid, a figure that looked eerily like Captain Fay, still trying to steer his doomed ship. Locals began to speculate that the storm had claimed the Mermaid, but the crew's spirits had not found peace. They believed that the ship was cursed and would never be able to rest at the bottom of the ocean, doomed to sail the waters of Peggy's Cove for eternity. But as the years went by, strange things began to happen, things that could not be easily explained. It was said that on particularly stormy nights, when the waves crashed violently against the cliffs, sailors would spot a faint light on the horizon, drifting in and out of view. Some claimed it was the light of the Mermaid, glowing eerily from the surface of the water, as if trying to guide ships into its watery grave. Others claimed to see a large dark ship sailing through the fog, but when they approached, it would vanish, leaving only the sound of the wind and the waves behind. One evening in 1923, Thomas Porter, a young man working as an assistant keeper at Peggy's Cove Lighthouse, had a terrifying encounter with the ghost ship. It was a cold, foggy night, and the lighthouse light had just been lit when Porter noticed something strange on the water. At first, it seemed to be nothing more than the usual fog creeping in, but as he gazed out into the distance, he saw a faint light moving through the mist. The light was far too bright and constant to be a ship's lantern, yet it pulsed as though it were alive. Porter climbed to the top of the lighthouse tower to get a better look. As he peered through the lenses of the lighthouse, he saw it, a massive black-hulled ship emerging from the mist. It sailed through the fog with unnatural precision, and as it passed the lighthouse, Porter swore he could see figures on the deck. Their faces were pale and distorted, staring back at him with hollow eyes. The ship was surrounded by an otherworldly glow, and despite the fog, it seemed to move effortlessly through the water, as if it was not bound by the same laws of nature. Terrified, Porter rang the bell at the lighthouse, signaling for help. But when other members of the crew arrived, the ship was gone. No one else had seen it, and when they checked the water, there was no trace of the ship. Porter, however, was certain that what he had seen was real. The ghostly ship had passed right under the lighthouse's beam, and the figures had gazed back at him with eyes full of sorrow and dread. From that night on, strange things continued to happen around the lighthouse. Crew members reported hearing eerie noises at night, whispers, footsteps, and the sound of chains dragging across the floor of the lighthouse. On stormy nights, the light in the tower would flicker and dim, as though it were fighting to stay lit. Some nights, the lighthouse would light up in the glow of an unearthly green hue, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Years passed, but the legend of the ghost ship persisted. Locals continued to report seeing strange lights on the water, and sailors told tales of a dark ship that would appear out of the fog, only to disappear again without a trace. As the years went by, some claimed to have seen the Mermaid itself, alive, sailing through the fog, with Captain Fay still at the wheel. Others said the ship would appear to ships passing by the cove, guiding them toward dangerous rocks before vanishing into the mist. The most unsettling part of the legend, however, was the claim that the ghost ship had a terrible power over the lighthouse itself. On certain nights, when the fog was thickest, it was said that the ghostly ship would pass directly beneath the lighthouse tower, causing the lighthouse to shake violently. The light would flicker and sputter, as if it were being stolen by an unseen force. According to the locals, this was the ship's curse. Whenever it appeared, it would demand a sacrifice, taking something from the lighthouse each time. In the late 1940s, the lighthouse was automated, and the keeper's position was eliminated. But even after the lighthouse became fully automated, strange occurrences continued to plague the area. Visitors to Peggy's Cove reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread near the lighthouse, and some even claimed to have seen the ghostly figures of the crew standing on the cliffs, watching them with hollow eyes. One particular incident in the 1950s stood out. A group of tourists, visiting the lighthouse during a particularly stormy night, claimed to have witnessed the mermaid in full form, sailing directly into the cove. The ship appeared through the mist, glowing with an eerie light, and just as it reached the rocks near the lighthouse, it disappeared without a trace. The tourists were so terrified that they fled the scene, but when they returned the next day, there was no sign of the ship or the figures on the deck. To this day, the ghost ship of Peggy's Cove remains one of the most enduring and chilling tales associated with the lighthouse. Some believe it is simply a myth, while others are certain that the ghostly ship still sails the waters off Peggy's Cove, seeking to claim new victims and forever cursed by the events of that fateful storm. The eerie glow on the horizon, the strange figures in the fog, and the flickering light of the lighthouse are reminders of the tragedy that still haunts the shores of Peggy's Cove. The ghostly keeper of Point Sur Lighthouse. Point Sur Lighthouse stands on a rugged promontory on the central coast of California, its beacon cutting through the mist and fog that often envelops the coastline. The lighthouse was built in 1889 to help ships navigate the treacherous waters off the Pacific coast, known for their dangerous rocks and unpredictable currents. Over the years, the lighthouse has saved countless vessels from disaster, but it also carries with it a darker legacy, one filled with strange occurrences, eerie apparitions, and a tragic story that still haunts the lighthouse to this day. The story begins in 1920 when the lighthouse was being manned by William Westbrook, a grizzled and solitary lighthouse keeper. Westbrook had been assigned to Point Sur for many years, and during that time, he had become known for his commitment to the job. He was a quiet, reserved man, dedicated to keeping the light shining and ensuring the safety of the passing ships. However, behind Westbrook's calm exterior was a man haunted by a deep sadness, one that he kept hidden from the other lighthouse keepers. Before arriving at Point Sur, Westbrook had lost his wife and child in a tragic accident. They had been on a ship bound for California, but the ship had encountered a violent storm, and it sank in the cold, unforgiving waters of the Pacific. Westbrook was devastated by the loss, and ever since, he had thrown himself into his work, seeking solace in the isolation of Point Sur. The lighthouse keeper's quarters were small and sparse, perched on a cliff that offered breathtaking views of the ocean below. But despite the beauty of the surroundings, Westbrook felt a constant sense of dread, as though the ocean and the winds carried the voices of the dead. He often spent his nights walking the lighthouse tower, the sound of his boots echoing through the silence, his thoughts consumed by grief. It was during one of these long, solitary nights that Westbrook began to experience the first signs of the lighthouse's haunting. One evening, while performing his usual checks in the tower, he noticed a faint glow in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a reflection off the water, perhaps, but as he stared into the darkness, the glow seemed to grow brighter. It was not the usual flickering of distant ships or the normal beams of light from other lighthouses. This light was strange, unnatural. Curious and unnerved, Westbrook climbed the stairs to the lantern room and peered out over the cliffside. The light, which had now intensified, seemed to be coming from the direction of the rocks below, where the shipwrecks of the past lay hidden beneath the waves. Westbrook's heart began to race. The light flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, and for a split second, he thought he saw a figure standing by the water, a woman dressed in white, her features hidden in the mist. He blinked, and the figure was gone. From that night on, strange occurrences began to plague Westbrook's nights. He would hear footsteps echoing in the halls of the lighthouse when he was alone, and at times he would wake in the middle of the night to see a faint light coming from the tower, even though he was certain he had extinguished it. He began to question his sanity, wondering if the grief of losing his family had finally taken its toll on him. But the sightings didn't stop. They grew more frequent and more disturbing. One stormy night in 1923, while the waves crashed violently against the cliffs and the winds howled through the tower, Westbrook was startled by a knock on his door. He opened it to find no one there. The night was cold and still, and the only sound was the wind. But as he stepped outside, he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the cliff, facing the churning ocean. The figure was tall and thin, wearing a long dark cloak that billowed in the wind. Westbrook called out, but the figure didn't respond. Slowly it turned toward him, and Westbrook's blood ran cold. The figure's face was obscured by shadows, but the hollow eyes staring back at him sent a shiver down his spine. The figure took a step toward him, and before Westbrook could react, it vanished into the mist. Heart pounding, Westbrook rushed back inside, locking the door behind him. He had seen the figure again, the same mysterious presence that had haunted him for weeks. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt as though the figure had been waiting for him, drawing him closer. Over the next few weeks, Westbrook's behavior grew more erratic. He became obsessed with the figure, convinced that it was a manifestation of his grief or a warning from the past. He started to believe that the lighthouse was cursed, that the spirits of the dead sailors who had perished in the surrounding waters were trapped in the fog, unable to move on. And he believed that the figure was somehow tied to these lost souls, a woman whose fate had been intertwined with his own tragedy. One night during a particularly fierce storm, Westbrook climbed to the top of the lighthouse tower one last time. He was determined to confront the figure that had been haunting him. As he gazed out over the raging sea, the wind whipped through his coat, and the rain lashed against the window panes. Suddenly the light flickered, and in the distance, he saw it again. The figure standing by the water, illuminated by an unnatural glow. This time, Westbrook didn't hesitate. He bolted out of the lighthouse and descended the steep cliffside, his heart racing in his chest. As he neared the edge of the rocks, the figure turned to face him, its features now visible in the dim light. The woman's face was pale and ghostly, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted in a mournful expression. Her eyes locked onto his, and she took a step toward him. Before Westbrook could react, the ground beneath his feet gave way, and he plunged into the icy waters below. The waves swallowed him whole, and the lighthouse beam, which had once been a guide for ships, now seemed to mock him, casting its cold light across the sea. The ghostly figure was gone. The next morning, when the storm had passed, Westbrook's body was found washed up on the rocks. His face was frozen in an expression of terror, and his hands were outstretched as if reaching for something that he would never be able to grasp. To this day, locals claim that the ghostly keeper of Point Sur Lighthouse still haunts the cliffs, wandering the tower and the surrounding coastline. Visitors who brave the lighthouse's isolated location report seeing strange lights in the distance, hearing footsteps on the cliffs, and occasionally witnessing a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the rocks, staring out at the ocean. Some believe that William Westbrook's ghost never left, forever tied to the lighthouse where he spent his last moments. The lighthouse continues to stand, its light flashing across the waters of the Pacific. But for those who know the story, it serves as a chilling reminder of the curse that haunts the cliffs of Point Sur. The Phantom of East Brother Island Lighthouse. East Brother Island Lighthouse, located in the San Francisco Bay, is one of the most charming and historic lighthouses in California. However, beneath its picturesque facade lies a dark and eerie history that has left many who visit the island haunted by strange encounters and unsettling experiences. The story of the Phantom of East Brother Island Lighthouse begins in 1890, when the lighthouse was first built. It's said that the ghost of a former keeper haunts the lighthouse, forever tethered to the island where he met a tragic and mysterious end. The keeper in question was Charles Martin, a man who had served as a lighthouse keeper in the Bay Area for many years. He was a solitary figure, a man of few words, known for his diligence and commitment to keeping the lighthouse operational. Charles was a widower, and after the death of his wife, he retreated into his work, finding solace in the isolation of the lighthouse. He had no children, no family to visit, and he spent most of his time maintaining the light and keeping watch over the bay. His only companion was the sea, which he had come to know as intimately as his own reflection. In the fall of 1912, East Brother Island's lighthouse underwent a major renovation. Charles was in charge of overseeing the repairs, and for weeks he was consumed by the demands of the project. He spent long hours, sometimes even overnight, in the tower, supervising the workers and making sure the structure was sound. But as the renovation progressed, strange things began to happen at the lighthouse. At first, it was little more than a few unexplained noises, scratching at the windows, whispers in the walls, and the occasional creak of the wooden floors. But as the days wore on, the occurrences became more frequent, more unnerving. One night, as Charles was making his rounds through the lighthouse, he heard something he couldn't explain. Footsteps. But these footsteps were different. They didn't belong to a man, and they didn't sound like the footsteps of someone walking around the tower. Instead, they echoed through the narrow halls, heavy and deliberate, as though someone was pacing back and forth. Charles called out, thinking it was one of the workers who had stayed behind. But when no response came, he grew suspicious. He searched every room, but there was no one there. As the days passed, Charles grew increasingly uneasy. The sounds continued, growing louder each night. The whispers, the footsteps, and the occasional glimpse of a shadow darting across the walls began to fray his nerves. He told himself it was just the isolation getting to him. He had been spending too much time in the lighthouse, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. It wasn't long before he began to see things that couldn't be explained. Figures in the corner of his vision, fleeting glimpses of people standing in the tower's windows, and the feeling of being watched from the darkness. On one particularly stormy night, when the waves of the bay crashed violently against the rocks and the winds howled through the lighthouse, Charles had an experience that would haunt him for the rest of his days. As he was climbing the stairs to the lantern room, the cold wind carrying the smell of salt and seaweed, he saw a figure standing at the top of the tower, gazing out over the bay. The figure was tall, thin, and wearing a long, dark coat. Charles called out, but the figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, motionless, staring out into the darkness. Charles slowly approached, but just as he reached the top of the stairs, the figure vanished. Terrified, Charles rushed to the window and looked out over the bay, but there was no one to be seen. The storm had worsened, and the only light came from the lighthouse itself. The eerie sensation of being watched remained, but Charles couldn't shake the feeling that the figure had been real. It wasn't a trick of the light or his imagination. Something, someone, was there with him. As the nights passed, the occurrences only grew more intense. The footsteps became more frequent, echoing throughout the tower. The whispers grew louder, now speaking in words that Charles couldn't understand. The shadowy figures became more defined, lingering in the corners of the rooms and moving just out of sight. Charles knew he couldn't take it much longer. The isolation was breaking him. But he also knew that the lighthouse was his duty, and he couldn't abandon it. On November 8, 1930, Charles Martin was found dead in the lighthouse. His body was discovered by one of the relief keepers who had arrived to take over for the night. There were no signs of foul play or injury. Charles had simply passed away in his sleep, his face frozen in an expression of terror. His body was still warm when he was found, but there was no indication of what had caused his death. The doctors who examined him found nothing physically wrong with him, and no explanation was ever given for his untimely demise. As news of Charles's death spread, locals began to share stories of strange occurrences at the lighthouse. They spoke of hearing eerie noises, of seeing figures in the windows, and of feeling an overwhelming sense of dread when they visited the island. The lighthouse was said to be haunted by the spirit of Charles Martin, the keeper who had become consumed by his own fear and isolation. The legend grew, and soon the ghostly figure of Charles became a staple of local folklore. But the haunting didn't stop with Charles's death. Over the years, numerous lighthouse keepers and visitors to East Brother Island Lighthouse reported strange phenomena: cold spots, disembodied voices, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing through the empty tower. Some claimed to have seen the ghost of Charles standing at the top of the lighthouse, staring out over the bay, forever watching the waters he had once guarded. Others reported seeing a shadowy figure moving through the rooms, or feeling a cold hand brush against their skin in the dead of night. In the 1970s, a group of paranormal investigators visited the lighthouse, hoping to capture evidence of the haunting. They spent an entire night inside the lighthouse, documenting their findings with cameras and recording equipment. Throughout the night, the investigators heard footsteps, whispers, and the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open when no one was near. At one point, they captured an EVP recording of a voice that clearly said, "I'm still here." The voice sounded faint, but unmistakably human, as if calling out from beyond the grave. Despite these eerie occurrences, the lighthouse remains a popular tourist destination. Visitors can stay overnight at the lighthouse, and many have reported similar experiences to those of the past: the feeling of being watched, the strange sounds, and the inexplicable sights. The ghost of Charles Martin is said to still haunt the lighthouse, trapped between the world of the living and the dead, forever bound to the island he once watched over. Today, East Brother Island Lighthouse stands as a reminder of the past, its beacon still guiding ships safely through the fog. But for those who know its dark history, The lighthouse is much more than a navigational aid. It is a place of mystery and death, where the past lingers and the spirits of the dead refuse to rest.
Subscribe, share, and click that bell icon.
The Vanishing Keeper of the Great Point Lighthouse. The Great Point Lighthouse, located on Nantucket Island, Massachusetts, is one of the most historic and significant lighthouses in the United States. It has guided ships safely around the dangerous shoals and reefs of the island since it was built in 1784. The lighthouse is still operational today, and while its towering structure stands as a symbol of hope for sailors, it is also known for the chilling story of a lighthouse keeper who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only eerie whispers and haunting tales that continue to disturb those who work or visit the lighthouse. The keeper in question was John Sullivan, a man who had worked as a lighthouse keeper for most of his adult life. John was known for his steadfast dedication to his job. He had served at several lighthouses along the New England coast before being assigned to Great Point Lighthouse in 1896. He was a quiet, solitary man, never one for socializing, and he took comfort in the isolation of his job. The only company he had was the sea, the occasional visitor, and the nearby small group of fishermen and their families who lived on the island. John had been at Great Point Lighthouse for nearly 2 years, and everything seemed to be going well. The light was operating properly, the lanterns were always filled with oil, and the surrounding coastline remained free from any maritime disasters. However, as the months passed, John's behavior began to change. Those who visited the lighthouse to drop off supplies began to notice that he had become more withdrawn. His face appeared gaunt, his eyes sunken, and he began speaking less and less. He would often stare out into the vast, empty expanse of the ocean for hours, as though searching for something he couldn't quite explain. The first incident that caused concern was reported by a fisherman who had visited the lighthouse to deliver supplies. The fisherman noticed that, although the light was functioning properly, the doors to the lighthouse were locked. When he knocked, John did not answer. Concerned, the fisherman tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. After several attempts, the door creaked open, revealing an empty lighthouse. John's personal effects were still in the quarters, and the oil lamps were burning low, but John was nowhere to be found. The fisherman called out to John but received no response. The air inside the lighthouse was thick with an unnatural stillness. He searched the tower, the rooms, and the kitchen, but there was no sign of the keeper. However, as he ascended the stairs to the lantern room, the fisherman swore he felt something cold brush against his skin. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. Just as he reached the top, he saw something even more disturbing. There, at the edge of the lantern room, stood a dark figure, a shadowy figure that appeared to be looking out at the sea. Terrified, the fisherman ran back down the pole, stairs, and left the lighthouse as quickly as he could. He later reported the strange occurrence to the authorities, but when a search party was sent to the lighthouse, no trace of John Sullivan was found. His personal belongings were still in the quarters, and the light continued to shine as though nothing had changed. It was as though John had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but an eerie presence that seemed to linger in the lighthouse. Over the next several weeks, locals reported hearing strange sounds around the lighthouse, scraping noises, faint whispers, and the sound of footsteps on the staircase, though no one was seen. Fishermen passing by the island would sometimes see a figure standing at the top of the lighthouse, staring out at the sea. However, when they approached the island to investigate, the figure would disappear. The most unsettling part of the mystery was that the lighthouse seemed to be functioning perfectly. Despite the absence of the keeper, the light never went out. The lanterns were always filled with oil. The beam continued to rotate, and the sound of the foghorn could still be heard through the mist. It was as though the lighthouse was still being tended to, but by an unseen hand. In the years that followed, rumors began to circulate about the disappearance of John Sullivan. Some claimed that he had gone mad from the isolation, that the constant exposure to the sea and the wind had driven him to insanity. Others believed that he had been taken by a supernatural force, perhaps the very ocean he had spent his life serving. The idea of a haunted lighthouse grew, and soon people started to say that John's ghost still haunted the tower, forever bound to the lighthouse he had once tended. In the 1920s, a group of paranormal investigators visited the lighthouse to look into the rumors. They arrived at the island on a foggy evening and set up their equipment in the hope of capturing any paranormal activity. Throughout the night, the investigators reported hearing strange noises, scratching sounds coming from the walls, footsteps echoing in the corridors, and even the faint sound of someone whispering in the dark. The investigators also claimed to have seen a shadowy figure in the tower, moving from window to window, its shape barely visible through the fog. At one point during the investigation, one of the team members captured a chilling EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, recording. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It said, "I'm still here. Don't leave me." The investigators were certain they had captured the voice of John Sullivan, still trapped in the lighthouse, forever waiting for someone to find him. Despite these findings, the mystery of John Sullivan's disappearance remains unsolved to this day. Some believe that his ghost still haunts the lighthouse, forever lost to the sea, while others think that he may have been taken by the ocean itself. The ghostly figure seen at the top of the lighthouse, the strange noises in the tower, and the feeling of being watched have continued to haunt those who visit the lighthouse. Today, the Great Point Lighthouse stands as a historic monument, a symbol of the perseverance of lighthouse keepers who dedicated their lives to ensuring the safety of sailors. But for those who know the story of John Sullivan, the lighthouse is a chilling reminder that some spirits refuse to leave, bound forever to the place where they disappeared. The whispers in the wind, the flickering light in the tower, and the eerie figure in the fog all serve as a reminder that sometimes the past is never truly gone. It lingers, waiting to be discovered. The haunting of the St. George Reef Lighthouse. The St. George Reef Lighthouse stands on a rocky outcrop in the Pacific Ocean, about 6 miles off the northern coast of California. The lighthouse was built in 1889 to warn ships of the treacherous rocks that had claimed many vessels over the years. Its towering structure stands resilient against the relentless tides and heavy storms, but beneath its weathered exterior lies a terrifying history, a history of loss, isolation, and unexplained disappearances. One of the most chilling events associated with the St. George Reef Lighthouse took place in 1939 when a man named Franklin Graves was assigned to serve as the head keeper of the lighthouse. Graves was a quiet, dependable man with a reputation for being calm under pressure. He had spent years working at various lighthouses along the Pacific coast before being transferred to St. George Reef. The isolated location, perched on a small island surrounded by dangerous reefs, made it one of the most difficult posts for a lighthouse keeper. Upon arriving at the lighthouse, Graves was struck by its eerie and desolate nature. The island itself was barren, surrounded by jagged rocks and constant waves crashing against the shore. The lighthouse was a solitary outpost, miles away from any form of civilization. The only other inhabitants were the occasional relief keepers who would rotate in and out every few weeks. The isolation was almost unbearable. But Graves took the job seriously and began his work immediately, ensuring that the light would continue to shine every night. However, it wasn't long before the strange occurrences began. The first sign of something unnatural came on a foggy morning when Graves noticed something odd about the light's reflection in the glass. As he adjusted the lens, he swore he saw a figure standing in the distance. At first, just a shadow in the mist. Thinking it was another worker or perhaps a ship passing by, Graves took no immediate action. But as he peered through the lens, he saw the figure again, standing motionless near the rocks, just outside the light's reach. When Graves rushed outside to investigate, there was no one there. The strange sightings continued over the next few weeks. Graves began to hear voices, faint and unintelligible, carried on the wind. At night, he would often wake to the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallways of the lighthouse. But when he checked, there was no one there. It wasn't just the sounds that unsettled him. The air itself seemed to change, growing thick and heavy as though something was pressing down on the lighthouse. Graves felt as though he were being watched, and each night the feeling grew stronger. One night, during a particularly violent storm, the phenomena escalated. Graves was in the lantern room, watching the storm rage outside, when he heard a loud crash coming from the lower floors of the lighthouse. Rushing down the stairs, he found that a heavy piece of furniture had been thrown across the room, leaving a large dent in the wall. He couldn't explain how it had happened, as the storm had not been strong enough to cause any damage inside the building. The wind howled outside, but there was no sign of anyone else in the lighthouse. The eerie silence that followed the crash felt suffocating, and Graves immediately bolted the door to his quarters and locked himself inside. But it was only the beginning. The next morning, the strange events reached a new level of terror. Graves awoke to find all of his belongings scattered across the floor, as though someone had rifled through his personal effects. His uniform was gone, along with several of his tools and supplies. In their place, he found old, weathered objects, things that didn't belong to him. There were ancient nautical charts, half-burnt pieces of wood, and broken compasses, items that looked as though they had been abandoned for decades. He could not explain how they had come to be there, or why they had appeared overnight. Graves's isolation became unbearable. He began to hear the same voices again, but this time they seemed clearer, more distinct. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were full sentences, some of them in languages he didn't understand. At night he could hear knocking at the door, followed by footsteps that circled the lighthouse. Graves felt the presence of something, or someone, trapped in the lighthouse with him. But whenever he would open the door or investigate, there was nothing to be found. One fateful night, as the fog rolled in thick and heavy, Graves decided to confront the source of the disturbances. He took a lantern and ventured outside, following the dim light toward the rocks where he had seen the figure on his first night. As he walked along the jagged shoreline, the wind whipped against his face, and the fog swallowed him whole. It was so thick, he could barely see his own hand in front of him. Then as he approached the rocks, he saw the figure again, a dark silhouette standing in the mist, just outside the range of his lantern light. Graves called out, but the figure didn't respond. Slowly, he walked closer, the sound of his boots crunching on the wet stones beneath him. As he neared the figure, the mist parted, revealing a man, his clothes tattered and old, his face obscured by shadows. The man reached out to Graves, and in a voice that was both cold and pleading, he whispered, "Help me. I can't leave." Before Graves could respond, the figure vanished into the fog, leaving behind only a faint, bitter chill in the air. Panicked and disoriented, Graves ran back to the lighthouse, his heart racing in his chest. When he arrived, he was stunned to find the door to his quarters wide open, the light inside flickering erratically. But when he stepped inside, there was no one there. The following morning, Graves was gone. His relief keeper arrived to find the lighthouse empty. Graves's personal belongings were still in his quarters, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The light continued to shine, just as it had the night before. A search was conducted, but there was no trace of Graves. The sea surrounding the island was searched, and no body was ever recovered. What happened to Franklin Graves remains one of the greatest mysteries surrounding the St. George Reef Lighthouse. Some believe that Graves had simply gone mad from the isolation, driven to the edge by the constant strange occurrences and the oppressive atmosphere of the lighthouse. Others, however, believe that he met a far more sinister fate, that the ghostly figure he had encountered in the fog was somehow responsible for his disappearance. Perhaps it was a spirit from the past, a former keeper or sailor, who had been trapped on the island and was waiting for someone to take their place. In the years that followed Graves's disappearance, there were numerous reports from local fishermen and tourists of strange lights on the island, ghostly figures in the windows of the lighthouse, and unexplained noises carried on the wind. Some who have stayed overnight at the lighthouse claim to have heard the same whispers Graves had heard, along with the unsettling sound of footsteps walking through the halls. Visitors have also reported seeing a shadowy figure standing near the rocks at night, staring out over the ocean, waiting for something or someone. The haunting of the St. George Reef Lighthouse continues to this day, and the legend of Franklin Graves remains a chilling reminder of the price one must pay for isolation. The lighthouse still stands, its beam cutting through the fog. But for those who know its dark history, it is more than just a beacon for ships. It is a place where the spirits of the past are never truly at rest. The Cursed Light of Smalls. Smalls Lighthouse stands on a small, rocky islet off the coast of Pembrokeshire, Wales. Built in 1861, it has weathered countless storms, fogs, and rough seas, warning ships of the dangerous rocks below. The lighthouse, isolated and perched atop a small rocky outcrop, is an enduring symbol of resilience and survival. But for all its function as a guiding light for sailors, Smalls Lighthouse has a reputation for being cursed, a reputation rooted in the tragic death of one of its keepers and the eerie occurrences that followed. The story begins in 1801 when Thomas Griffith, a young and eager man from the Welsh countryside, was assigned to serve as the keeper of Smalls Lighthouse. He had come from a long line of lighthouse keepers and was determined to prove himself worthy of his position. The remote location of Smalls, accessible only by boat, didn't faze him. In fact, he welcomed the isolation, believing it would provide him with the peace and solitude he craved after losing his wife and child to a deadly fever. Thomas arrived at the lighthouse and was greeted with an overwhelming sense of loneliness. The only sounds were the crashing waves, the wind howling through the cliffs, and the occasional cry of a seabird. His job was simple but demanding. Tend to the lantern, maintain the equipment, and keep the lighthouse light burning to guide the passing ships. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Thomas began to feel something strange about the place. At first, it was subtle. Small things out of place in his quarters, the occasional flickering of the light when the wind howled, and the distinct sound of footsteps echoing in the tower when he was alone. He tried to ignore it, attributing it to the loneliness and stress of his new role. But things soon escalated. One night, during a fierce storm, Thomas noticed that the light in the lantern room was flickering in a way he had never seen before. As the winds howled louder and the rain pelted against the lighthouse, he climbed the stairs to investigate. As he reached the top, he felt a coldness wash over him, a chill that made the air feel unnatural. When he reached the lantern, he found it dimming, despite the wind and rain. As he moved closer, the lantern's light flared briefly, and in that brief moment of brightness, Thomas swore he saw a figure standing in the shadows at the edge of the room. The figure was tall and cloaked, its face hidden in darkness. Thomas froze, heart racing. He called out, but there was no response. As he reached out toward the figure, it vanished, leaving only a thick, unnatural fog in the air. He quickly checked the lantern, but there was no malfunction. The light flickered back to normal, and the coldness in the room dissipated. Yet the figure remained in his mind. For weeks after that night, Thomas was plagued by the strange figure. Every time he went to check the lantern or walked through the lighthouse, he would catch glimpses of it, always in the shadows, always just out of reach. The sound of footsteps, whispers in the dark, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched became a constant presence in Thomas's life. He began to fear the lighthouse itself, but he felt trapped. There was nowhere else for him to go. The isolation of the island was complete. As the months passed, Thomas's mental state deteriorated. He became more reclusive, speaking less and less to the fishermen who brought supplies to the island. He would often look out over the sea, staring for hours as though searching for something. The once proud keeper of Small's lighthouse was now a broken man, haunted by the specter of the figure he couldn't escape. Then one night in 1803, Thomas completely vanished. The storm that night was ferocious, but when the weather cleared, the lighthouse was still operational, and the light was shining as bright as ever. However, when a passing ship docked, and the relief keeper arrived at Small's lighthouse, they found no sign of Thomas. His quarters were untouched, his personal effects left behind, but he was gone, vanished without a trace. No one ever saw him again. The mystery of Thomas's disappearance was never solved. Some believed he had gone mad and wandered off into the sea, lost to the waves. Others said he was taken by the ghostly figure he had seen so many times in the shadows of the lighthouse. The local fishermen and villagers soon began to whisper of the curse of Small's lighthouse, an ancient curse that had claimed many of the keepers who had served there over the years. Strangely, after Thomas's disappearance, reports of strange occurrences around Small's lighthouse only increased. Sailors passing by the island reported seeing a faint light shining from the top of the tower, even though the lighthouse had long since been automated. Local fishermen spoke of seeing a dark figure walking along the cliffs, always just beyond their reach. Some claimed to have heard the sound of footsteps, or the faint echo of a voice calling out for help when they approached the island. In 1864, a group of paranormal investigators arrived at Small's lighthouse, hoping to unravel the mystery of the hauntings. They set up equipment to measure any anomalous readings, and as they explored the tower, they reported hearing strange sounds, scraping noises, whispers, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing through the tower. One of the investigators, while examining the lantern room, claimed to have seen the same shadowy figure that Thomas had described years earlier. The figure appeared for a brief moment, only to vanish when they approached. The investigators also recorded several EVP sessions where the voice of a man could be heard clearly saying, "Help me." The investigators left the island with no answers, but they agreed that the lighthouse was haunted. The figure, they believed, was the restless spirit of Thomas, forever trapped in the lighthouse he had once tended. Some of the researchers speculated that the figure might be someone else, a former keeper who had met a tragic end. But no one could deny the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the lighthouse. The curse of Small's lighthouse had not ended with Thomas's disappearance, and to this day, the island remains one of the most haunted places along the Welsh coast. Visitors who have spent the night at Small's lighthouse have reported similar experiences: flickering lights, strange, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Some claim to have seen the figure of a man standing in the tower window, staring out over the sea. The ghostly figure, some believe, is still looking for a way to escape the lighthouse that has trapped him for so many years. The haunting of Small's lighthouse continues to this day, its light shining out over the treacherous waters. But for those who know its dark history, the lighthouse is more than just a beacon for ships. It is a place of mystery, death, and a curse that refuses to let go.